Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Welcome. So tonight, at least where I am, it's evening. We want to speak about what it means to live on the edge of evolution, on the very edge of the creative impulse. And very specifically, I want to try and articulate, explicate, define, give all of you a sense, an idea, a feeling of what a truly liberated, inherently creative, evolutionary inspired relationship to the human experience actually is. This is what I want to try and do. But at the very beginning of the presentation, I wanted to make clear, as I often do, that the context in which I teach and all the points I'm trying to make about life and about reality and about the human experience are all from the perspective of awakened consciousness or enlightened awareness as I experience it and as I understand it. So it's a unique vantage point. It's a very particular way of seeing reality, understanding reality, and relating to reality. But I want to make clear it is not the only way to see reality. It's not the only way to understand reality. And it's not the only way to make sense out of reality, but it's an important one. And what makes what I'm defining as the enlightened perspective or the enlightened vantage point uniquely profound and uniquely significant as we try and come to terms with what it means to be human, what it means to be conscious, what it means to be conscious, is this, is because when we awaken to enlightened awareness, when our consciousness expands, in the enlightenment context, there's a shift in our experience of consciousness and cognition from what could be called a relative perspective, relative understanding, relative consciousness, and relative cognition, to absolute consciousness and absolute cognition. So it's hard to understand what the difference between relative and absolute actually means outside of having the actual experience of what it means. Otherwise, it tends to become way too intellectually abstract a distinction. But we got to work with where we are. So everybody do the best they can. But I want to say that that when we consciously choose to embrace the unique perspective that becomes available to us when we awaken to enlightened awareness, we are choosing to embrace a non-relative or absolute position in relationship to being human. And if we choose to take an absolute position in relationship to the challenge of being human, it's important that we clearly understand that we're doing that, and we clearly understand that this absolute vantage point, this absolute perspective, this absolute position is realizable. It's realizable, and it's possible to have an experience of what that means. But as a human being, it's impossible to reach it or to equal it. This is the absolute position, the absolute vantage point, which enters into our awareness and our understanding in higher states of consciousness. When we transcend the ego and the small self, reveals to us a non-relative or absolute dimension of reality, which is definitely higher and inherently free and liberated in ways that relative reality, relative consciousness, relative cognition, relative experience never is and never will be. So as I describe this non-relative or absolute vantage point from the perspective of the evolutionary impulse, I want you all to understand that I'm describing a possibility and a potential that is ultimately unattainable. And a big part of the teaching of evolutionary enlightenment, which is what I teach, is a big theme in this teaching is to reach beyond ordinary boundaries as we strive to evolve and strive to become more conscious and strive to actualize and realize and liberate all the inherent creative potentials that exist within us. But it becomes apparent pretty soon that unless we all are willing to make the heroic spiritual effort to liberate these extraordinary potentials within us, that we're never going to do it. And so I found that while we reach for what I'm defining as being absolute in this creative context, we're reaching for a possibility we're never going to be able to fully attain as long as we're in this human body and mind, in this human frame. It's in and through the reaching that new and extraordinary potentials and powers and possibilities begin to reveal themselves and manifest themselves. And they manifest themselves only because we were reaching beyond ordinary boundaries, which most people don't like to do or not in the habit of doing. The evolutionary relationship to enlightenment is very goal-oriented. It's actually about liberating capacities of consciousness, cognition, and ways of seeing reality that we need to reach for, that they won't just reveal themselves to us of their own accord. We have to be interested in cracking the atom, so to speak, of our own ignorance in the context of an evolutionarily inspired enlightenment. It was in the reaching, when we stretch beyond the normal boundaries, when we break the boundaries of our own multidimensional levels of inertia, refusal, resistance, ignorance, arrogance, stupidity, selfishness, and narcissism, that extraordinary things begin to reveal themselves and become apparent to us that we just had no idea existed. So this non-relative or absolute dimension of reality reveals to us miraculous potentials. And that's what I want to talk about. To continue along these lines, the paradox of enlightenment has to do with the fact that we're all mortal human beings. So we are physically mortal and frail and vulnerable. We are emotionally and psychologically mortally frail and vulnerable. We're all imperfect, and we're never going to be able to get anywhere near being perfect expressions and manifestations of human potential, because it's never happened before. Perfection exists as an ideal that exists somewhere in the distant future. And as I've been saying, if we continue to reach for perfection, we can realize moments of grace and give rise to possibilities that are truly miraculous, but are not yet truly perfect. So there's in this enlightenment process, we are trying to straddle two boats. One of those boats exists in the non-relative or absolute dimension of reality, and the other boat exists in the relative dimension of reality. And what we want to do through spiritual practice and inquiry and investigation and commitment, we want to learn how to balance these relative and absolute dimensions of reality, and learn how to balance them exquisitely, elegantly, beautifully. Some people go too far in either direction and make a terrible mistake as they leave out one side of the picture. So some realizers in the Enlightenment traditions, when they awaken, they will claim that only the absolute is real, and everything relative, gross and subtle, is all part of that which is unreal. And so in those traditions, using that kind of contextual framework, a significant part of the experience of being human, which exists in relative reality, is somehow being avoided and denied, and not honestly and truthfully being fully embraced and responded to, I believe. I don't think I'm the only one who sees it that way. And that's one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, there's people who deny that any kind of absolute or non-relative dimension of reality or consciousness actually exists. And people speaking from such a vantage point would say that which is purely relative is all there is, tragically. So to use mythic language, they would proclaim that God doesn't really exist, or there's no such thing as an absolute principle that exists, the discovery of which changes everything and becomes the source of our liberation. They would deny it. They say it's all a realm of fantasy and imagination, religious and spiritual fantasy and imagination. So what I try and do is I try and do the best I can to make clear to everybody, as my teacher made clear to me, that relative and absolute are two sides of one coin. They're two parts of a whole picture of reality and of a whole experience of reality. Relative and absolute are one and not two. And the more we understand this, the more we make it possible for our experience of relative reality to inform our experience and understanding of absolute reality. In the same way, we want to learn how to have our experience of enlightened awareness of absolute reality inform our experience of relative reality. The challenge of being fully human in a difficult and challenging world. So that's kind of the big picture. Now, in my teaching of evolutionary enlightenment, for many years I've made this distinction between what I have chosen to call the Old Enlightenment and the New Enlightenment. And the Old Enlightenment, or I'm choosing to call the Old Enlightenment, is the being enlightenment. It's what the great Eckhart Tolle teaches so beautifully. It's what the Buddha was pointing to. It's the awakening to that which is changeless, timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless, and eternal. It's about the awakening to what the Buddha called the deathless, the uncreated, and the unborn. What Ramana Maharshi called the self. What Mahayana Buddhists often refer to as the deepest dimension of reality, which is voidness, emptiness, or nothingness. So in the traditional, what I call the Old Enlightenment, as we aspire to awaken to the enlightenment of the Buddha and of Ramana Maharshi, the goal in that context is usually the goal of freedom, inner freedom, of a radical, uncompromised, profound, almost inconceivable experience of liberation. And the experience of timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless, eternal liberation is definitely not nothing. It's definitely something. We don't want to underestimate the significance and the profundity of the experience of inner liberation. So the experience of inner liberation, of samadhi, of satori, of nirvana, if you're lucky enough to glimpse it, you'll know that you'll suddenly understand what the Buddha was talking about. You'll suddenly understand what Ramana Maharshi was talking about. It'll suddenly all make sense to you. And it'll never make sense to you unless you actually have the experience. But the experience is of a primordial, it's the discovery of a primordial state of being where liberation is all there is. There's only freedom. And in that miraculous state of consciousness, you find that miraculous inner freedom not only is your birthright, but has been available and present to you from the very beginning. You just didn't see it. You weren't aware of it because your attention was on other things. But in this miraculous state of inner freedom, the essence of it is the essence of it reveals itself to us when we let go of everything else. So the metaphor that I often use for letting go of everything else is having nothing, knowing nothing, and being no one. Zero. Emptiness. So in Buddhism, they tell us that the experience of profound liberation is freedom from attachment and freedom from desire. Having nothing, knowing nothing, and being no one is liberation. Having nothing, knowing nothing, and being no one is unconditional, radical, and profound liberation from attachment and longing. Having nothing, knowing nothing, and being no one. So the goal in this, what I call the Old Enlightenment, is to, at the level of our souls, the level of the soul, to have let go so deeply that there is an inner access to a state of infinite freedom, where there is a nothing that is synonymous with eternity. And in that nothing that is synonymous with eternity, there seems to be no such thing as birth, no such thing as death, no such thing as here, no such thing as there. But the idea is in this kind of primordial traditional enlightenment, the fundamental position of that kind of experience is being free from. I'm free from the mind. I'm free from identification with the body. I'm free from identification with time. I'm free from identification with the world. So, if you're free from conscious and unconscious attachment, and if you're free from longing for anything else than freedom, you're going to be pretty enlightened. But there's another kind of enlightenment that I want to speak about that relates to the subject of this gathering today, which is living on the edge of evolution. So in the context of the inherent creativity that is the manifest expression of the evolutionary impulse, when we look at enlightenment in the context of conscious evolution, we begin to see a very different kind of picture, because the question in the evolutionary context is, how free am I to respond? How free are you to respond to the recognition and to the revelation of evolutionary potential as it appears within your heart and mind? Are we attached, distracted, busy with other things, hopelessly dug in, consciously and unconsciously, and attached to first principles and first values that have nothing to do with the inherent creativity of the universe? Are we knowingly or unknowingly living in the past, living in old ideas about the meaning and purpose of life that have nothing to do with spiritual freedom and that have nothing to do with liberating our evolutionary potential? Because the most beautiful thing about the discovery of evolution is that because it's the recognition that the universe, that the creative process as a whole is moving. It's not static. The energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe right now is moving. It is always becoming more of what it can be, infinite complexification. It's on a journey of self-discovery and self-realization, as are all of us. So, does the picture of reality that we use to frame our experience, is the picture of reality that we use to frame our experience, is it a moving picture? Do we see the reality of the present moment emerging out of an evolutionary continuum, or do we see ourselves as living in a more or less a static frame based upon old ideas, whether these ideas are personal and psychological, related to our own unique soul's experience, or do we see ourselves and our values, and the values that we're consciously and unconsciously attached to and identified with as coming from an outdated past, in which those values no longer are actually relevant anymore? What world are we knowingly and unknowingly choosing to live in, to be acting from and within? So as you awaken to an evolutionary first values and first principles, the fact that the whole process, the whole universe is moving and it's becoming and complexifying constantly. And there's no such thing as anything static in this process. When you really let that truth into your soul, when you begin to feel within your own consciousness the presence of the vibration, the pulsation of the evolutionary impulse, of this sense, this feeling of movement and reaching towards the future, and you see that all of reality is moving. Nothing is fixed and static. And then you realize in that context, you begin to realize, to become aware of the fact that, as I've been saying, so many of your and our ideas, beliefs, attachments, fixations, fears and desires are all emerging in a very static context. It's not ultimately real. And not only is it not ultimately real, but it's not even in alignment with the evolutionary becoming of the universe. As integral philosophy tells us and makes clear to us, the universe has an inside and an outside. The outside of the universe is matter and energy, and the inside of the universe is subjectivity and consciousness. So as the exterior is part of a developmental process that's been in progress for about 14 billion years, it makes perfect sense that the inside of the universe, the within of things, the within of all things, has also been on a long journey. So is our experience of consciousness and cognition, and is our unique soul living in alignment with the evolutionary becoming of the cosmos? Usually, it's not the case. How do we see ourselves as unique human beings? How do we see ourselves in this picture? Do we see ourselves experiencing at the level of consciousness and cognition, and at the level of our souls? Do we feel that inner momentum of the evolving cosmos reaching ever forward into the future, trying to give rise to its own creativity, leading edge of its very own potentials? Do we feel that movement in ourselves? Do we feel ourselves looking towards the future, feeling towards the future? Do you feel within yourself a feeling towards the future? And in that feeling towards the future, a great yearning, great ecstatic yearning for what could be. And in the context in which I'm sharing this, the yearning for what could be is always that which has never existed before. It's always a higher and deeper possibility. It's always a step forward and a step up, a step beyond. There's always a reaching, an ecstatic reaching for the possible. And do you feel this reaching for the possible in your body, in your mind, and in your soul? Because in an evolutionarily inspired and informed enlightenment, the expression of that enlightenment in time and space is the liberated willingness and ability to respond without hesitation, fearlessly, to evolutionary opportunity. It means that you're available. It means that one is available. And most people aren't very, very available because we're stuck in old paradigms, old beliefs, old ways of thinking, feeling, desiring, old forms of attachment that might have been at the very leading edge or cutting edge 500 years ago, 400 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. So to live on the very edge of evolution means that we've aligned ourselves, we've consciously and deliberately chosen to align ourselves so profoundly with this evolutionary principle that we are spiritually and energetically and morally available to respond to the evolutionary potential that reveals itself. If we're going to be living on the edge of, if we're going to be living on the very edge of evolution, it means we have to be ready to respond. And we can only respond if we're committed to being ready to respond. And if we're going to be ready to respond at all, it means that our philosophy, that our life philosophy, our personal religious impulses would have to be aligned in a profound and significant way with the evolutionary impulse itself. And the evolutionary impulse is an experience of ecstatic urgency and a spiritually palpable feeling of evolutionary potential. But that's something we have to make ourselves free. We have to become free so that we will be available to respond to the call of evolution. So there's a distinction I often like to make in the teaching of evolutionary enlightenment, which I want to briefly bring up here because it's a good time to do it. And that is in the practice of what I was explaining is my definition of the traditional enlightenment, the being enlightenment, the enlightenment of the Buddha, the enlightenment that Eckhart Tolle talks about so beautifully, is the way to realize the being enlightenment is usually what happens is when you have a realization, when you experience a spiritual insight, moment of depth, experience a higher state of consciousness, consciousness of being, timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless, eternal being, eternal freedom. The response to those kinds of experiences always is to let go. And the more you let go into having nothing, knowing nothing, and being no one, zero, the more freedom you will experience as being. So in the being enlightenment, it's realize and let go. And we find for most of us, there's always more to let go of. Even if you're good at letting go, and even if you let go of a lot, one finds that in most cases there's always more to go. So realize and let go is the practice of being enlightenment, to put it in a nutshell. Realize and let go, realize and let go, realize and let go. But in the evolutionarily inspired enlightenment, the kind of enlightenment that reveals itself to us when we awaken to the evolutionary impulse, in evolutionary enlightenment, in evolutionarily inspired enlightenment, it's very different than it's realize and respond. Realize and respond now. Realize and respond. So if you, in other words, it means if you realize, if in a moment of spiritual realization, spiritual insight, you realize a great potential that wants to actualize itself within you or in the world around you, the world that you occupy, you realize a great potential that wants to actualize itself, then what you would do, if you were free, if you were liberated, would be to, without hesitation, respond to what you realized. You wouldn't wait. You wouldn't hesitate. You wouldn't have a cigarette and think about it. You take the leap of faith because you'd seen what's possible, and because you see yourself in that context as an instrument of evolution in human form, you would act immediately without hesitation and with total faith in what you'd seen. And the more you could do that, then what you see as mere potential eventually becomes actualized materially in the world that you help to give rise to and co-create through your presence here in the world. So in evolutionarily inspired enlightenment, it's not realize and let go, it's realize and respond. So therefore, to live on the very edge of evolution, to live on the edge of evolution also implies that we would become agents of the actualization of the evolutionary potential. It would mean that you were spiritually prepared, spiritually equipped to realize and respond when, sometime around nowish. Remember, enlightenment, whether it's being enlightenment or evolutionary enlightenment, is always about transcending ego. Enlightenment, whether it's being enlightenment or evolutionary enlightenment, is always about transcending ego. Always. Just to repeat in case anybody wasn't listening, enlightenment is always about transcending ego. So in evolutionary enlightenment, if you realize and respond without hesitating in an act of total faith, your ego has no time to interfere with the no but I. The ego is very good at interfering in the arising of evolutionary potential and in the actualization of evolutionary potential. The ego always has good excuses, good reasons, especially if smart people come up with very good reasons and very good excuses. And the ego will always phrase the excuse or the good reason with no but I. So the way it works is if you respond immediately without hesitation, without reservation, the ego has no chance to interfere. And the more you and I and we can learn how to respond to life without allowing our unenlightened egos to mess the whole thing up, which the ego very much likes to do, we can make some real progress in terms of the evolution of consciousness, progress in terms of the actualization of evolutionary potential, progress in relationship to the liberation of evolutionary potential. When you get really good at this, the becoming of the cosmos, the becoming of the interior of the cosmos, becomes palpably discernible within and between human actors. And that's when the show gets very exciting. When you go, wow, we're really on a journey of becoming, aren't we? And we're going somewhere, baby. It's happening in us and through us and between us. What's happening? It means the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, which means God. She's the only one who could have created the universe. It's becoming more conscious, more palpably present as the only actor that there truly is through us. And when you see this, when you feel this, and you know it's true because it starts happening through you, that's when your spiritual self-confidence goes through the roof. Because you realize the energy and intelligence that created the universe, the evolutionary impulse, is the spiritual principle that makes all things possible, is actually at work through us. That you realize that we're not victims of a material process. That we're not victims of a painfully material process, trying to do the best we can, but failing again and again. But at the deepest level, we begin to recognize what a profound role we actually are here to play in the unfolding of this inner intelligence that's so present in the process, which is normally so invisible to us. So living on the edge of evolution means we are available to actualize what becomes apparent to us in our deepest moments of self-realization, higher states of consciousness. Because what creates evolutionary momentum, creates the inner momentum, is I can learn to respond unselfconsciously without fear and doubt to interfere every time I have an insight. It's coming from the deepest part of me, my awakened soul. The momentum of the possible begins to be at work in and through my body and mind. We become engines of evolution, of evolutionary potential. And Lord knows, the world needs as much of that as possible, now more than ever. So the edge of evolution, the way I'm describing, doesn't live outside you. So a big part of how I would define the new enlightenment is that we need to first we need to do the spiritual work to awaken to and discover the evolutionary impulse within our own selves. Because it exists within you. The evolutionary impulse exists within you as a palpable vibration and pulsation. It's already there. You just got to discover it, and when you do, you're going to get very excited because it feels so powerful, so potent, so pregnant with creativity, and so alive, and so full of pure positivity. The evolutionary impulse as a felt experience feels like pure, unabashed, uncorrupted, unobstructed, overwhelming positivity. And what it feels like inside you, inside me, it feels like suddenly all things are possible, not naively so. So many human beings these days, for so many reasonable, good reasons, are consciously and unconsciously seem to be convinced that life is not such a good thing, that to be alive is not such a good thing, that a human birth is not a great gift, and that life and death is is full of so many problems, and that so little is possible. People feel this on a personal level because they personally had bad experiences in the past. You can feel very discouraged and depressed about human potential in general because of what a mess in so many areas we're making. So this can lead to, willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously, a tendency towards nihilism, cynicism, and doubt. And have no doubt that nihilism, cynicism, and doubt are suicidal tendencies if you're actually interested in spiritual awakening and enlightenment most of all. We're all vulnerable. We have to be very careful where we spend our time with our minds. We've got to think about life philosophically, ethically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually in ways that are very positive and in ways that will help us to nurture our own potential for liberation. So when you awaken to the evolutionary potential, you will feel all things are possible as a state, as the experience of a state of consciousness. It's not that it's going to be easy. It's not. It's the experience. The experience of the revelation that all things are possible doesn't mean all things becoming possible is going to be part of an easy ride. It might be a very hard ride, but fundamentally you can do it, and it can be done. It's the opposite of cynicism and nihilism and doubt. There is a kind of conviction, the conviction of the inherent goodness of life and of the will to exist, which is inherent in the universe, inherent in the evolutionary impulse. We begin to become conscious of that will to exist. It is the creative impulse, it is the evolutionary impulse. And you feel the pure positivity that is driving it. And you start to recognize that pure positivity that's driving the evolutionary impulse is not separate from the very best part of who you are and who I am and who we all are. And you go, wow, really? So then you discover that this inherent positivity is what's driving this whole process in the first place. And a materialist will never believe you, but if you have the experience, you realize that's actually true. Doesn't mean that life isn't hard and tough and full of paradoxes and contradictions and pain and suffering. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that the energy and intelligence that's driving this process, it's at the very core of everything. Inherent in it is the kind of positivity that we can't even begin to imagine with our minds. So the idea is, if we live on the very edge of evolution, we want to be in touch with that positivity that's not mind created. It's revealed to us in spiritual revelation. And it's being in contact with that kind of positivity that gives us the courage to live the spiritual life in earnest, in a frightened and confused, in an understandably frightened and confused world. The spiritual life must be lived in earnest, which means we really mean it. Means we're not afraid to live our spiritual values and our convictions in public, because we realize that for spirit to be able to, for the true nature of spirit to be able to reveal herself in a disbelieving world, some of us have to be willing to bear witness. It's not a new idea, but it's actually true. It takes courage. I sound a little bit, I can hear myself starting to begin to sound like a Christian. That's why I'm laughing at myself. But we human beings, emotionally, psychologically, philosophically, and metaphysically, tend to be very weak. Very few of us have the courage or the conviction of the strength of character and strength at the level of the soul to truly stand on our own 2 feet, independently. And it takes courage in a disbelieving modern and postmodern world that is so skewed by materialism and narcissism to have the courage to bear witness to real depth. Just because there's so much narcissism and materialism and small-mindedness and selfishness and ignorance doesn't mean that depth, beauty, and perfection doesn't exist at a deeper level. It does. Just because many people haven't found it yet or just stumbled upon it doesn't mean it's not there. But those of us who have had the good fortune and the good karma and the grace to have stumbled upon that perennial truth, sooner or later we have to have the courage to bear witness in our own ways, whatever that means, being different things to different people. So living on the edge of living on the edge of evolution means all these things. And more than anything else, it means because I've awakened to the evolutionary impulse, because I know that the absolute principle behind the creative process, the energy and intelligence that created the universe, the evolutionary impulse, is who and what God actually is. And that creative impulse, in order to create the future at the highest level, needs me, needs you, to be available and ready to respond. Because when you wake up to all of this, you realize what's called evolutionary non-duality, and you begin to see how your hands and feet, your heart, your eyes and your ears and your mind are not your own, but they are the eyes, feet, hands, heart and mind of the energy and intelligence that created the universe. They're not yours. The ego is a very small part of a much bigger picture. The ego is just the ego is useful because it helps it makes it possible for you to have a frontal self, a frontal personality through which that energy and intelligence, that creative energy and intelligence can express itself through a frontal self and frontal personality. So in that sense, the ego is not a problem, but the ego becomes a problem when it thinks that it's the center of the universe and the organizing principle behind all this, and it's not. But when you awaken to evolution, you awaken to a process perspective in the sense that you realize that your body, mind, and soul are here for a reason, and they're here to participate in the evolutionary process as consciously as it's possible for you, for your unique soul. The universe becomes conscious through you, and the universe becomes conscious through me, it becomes conscious through us. The universe is not inherently conscious out there. The universe is not inherently conscious out there. To repeat, the universe is not inherently conscious out there. The universe is conscious in here, within us and between us. And the universe can become more conscious within us and between us. The universe out here can become more conscious within us and between us if we're willing to live the spiritual life in earnest, the religious life in earnest. So the universe out there becomes more conscious through us. That's a very important principle. It's something very important to understand in evolutionary enlightenment, in evolutionary metaphysics, as I understand it. This changes everything. It's changed everything for me. It's evolutionary non-duality. It's when you come to recognize that that interiority exists as an inherent fact in the cosmos and in nature. But as the universe evolves through life and the complexification of life, the capacity for the interiority of the cosmos grows and deepens and complexifies. And when you experience the spiritual impulse, which is the urge to become conscious, vibrating and pulsating within your own self, that's when you realize the universe is trying to become more conscious through you. So let that hit you. The universe is really trying to become more conscious through you. And at that level of evolutionary development, when you understand that, you know why you're here. And it's not about your personal life. This is not a personal journey. By the way, thank God, it's not a personal journey. If it was, it really would be only a nightmare, wouldn't it? So when you realize all these things, you wake up from the nightmare of the personal life, and you realize the cosmos is in fact alive and awake to itself, and that you and me and I and all of us, individually and collectively, all have a role to play if we make ourselves available. And the profundity of the experience of consciousness and of being alive is realized to the degree to which we understand that. Life is a great adventure, full of so much unmanifest potential, and actualizing that potential and consciously actualizing that potential is what this life is all about. Now, if you choose to live the spiritual life in earnest, and if that would mean to you living on the edge of evolution, it'll have a big effect on the life you're living. Because if that's something you choose to do, you'll find you can't live your life in the old way anymore. Because the edge of evolution is a real edge. And the more courage you have, the more courage one has to walk a little farther out on that ledge, the more thrilling is the ride.